Rebecca Torres had stayed in hundreds of hotels during her 15 years as a travel photographer, but the moment she stepped into the lobby of the Grand Monarch Hotel, she felt something crawling under her skin, like thousands of tiny insects, and the ornate chandelier above her head seemed to sway despite the complete absence of any breeze. Desk clerk was a pale, thin man with eyes that never quite met hers, and when he handed her the room key, his fingers were ice cold and left a lingering smell of formaldehyde that made her stomach turn, but she convinced herself it was just her imagination because she desperately needed this job to pay off her mounting debts. Room 717 was at the end of a long corridor lined with vintage photographs of guests from decades past, and as Rebecca walked toward her door, she noticed that every single person in those old pictures had the same expression of barely contained terror in their eyes, as if they had seen something unspeakable. The room itself was elegantly decorated with antique furniture and heavy velvet curtains, but there was an underlying smell of decay that no amount of air freshener could mask, and when Rebecca opened the bathroom door, she found dark stains on the marble floor that looked suspiciously like dried blood. She called the front desk to complain about the condition of the room, but the same pale clerk told her in a monotone voice that all their other rooms were occupied and that the stains were just mineral deposits from old plumbing, and his explanation sounded rehearsed, like he had given it many times before. That first night, Rebecca tried to sleep, but kept hearing soft sobbing sounds coming from the walls, and when she pressed her ear against the wallpaper, she could swear she heard voices whispering her name and begging for help. But every time she pulled away, the sounds stopped completely. She decided to explore the hotel with her camera, hoping to find some interesting architectural shots for her portfolio, but the elevator operator was the same pale man from the front desk, and he kept staring at her in the mirror with an expression that made her skin crawl with fear. The elevator stopped at the 3rd floor, even though she had pressed the button for the 5th, and when the doors opened, she saw a long hallway filled with wheelchairs and medical equipment, and the smell of antiseptic mixed with something much more sinister and organic. The pale man told her in that same monotone voice that the 3rd floor was restricted to hotel staff only, but Rebecca had already seen enough to know that this was no ordinary hotel, and that whatever was happening on that floor was connected to the strange atmosphere that permeated the entire building. Back in her room, she started researching the hotel online and discovered that it had been built on the site of a former psychiatric hospital that had been shut down in the 1950s after a series of mysterious patient deaths and unexplained disappearances that had never been properly investigated. The more she read, the more terrified she became, because guest reviews mentioned the same things she had experienced, including the sobbing sounds in the walls and the overwhelming smell of decay, and several reviewers mentioned seeing the same pale man working different jobs throughout the hotel. She tried to leave that night, but discovered that her car wouldn't start, and when she called for a taxi, the dispatcher told her that no drivers were willing to come to the Grand Monarch Hotel after dark because of what had happened to the last driver who had accepted a pickup there. Pale man appeared in her doorway without knocking and told her that she should get some sleep because tomorrow would be a very important day for her, and his smile revealed teeth that were stained black with something that definitely wasn't coffee. Rebecca barricaded her door with furniture and sat in the corner clutching her camera, but around midnight she heard footsteps in the hallway and voices discussing her room number and whether she was ready for the procedure, and her blood turned to ice. When she realized they were talking about Hirsch, she looked out the window and saw that the parking lot was filled with cars, but every single vehicle was covered in rust and moss, like they had been sitting there for decades, and some of the license plates had dates from the 1960s, and 1970 sobbing in the walls grew louder and more desperate, and Rebecca finally understood that she wasn't hearing ghosts, but living people who were trapped somewhere inside the building, and that the Grand Monarch Hotel was still operating as some kind of psychiatric facility as dawn approached. She heard a key turning in her lock despite the barricaded door, and the pale man walked through the furniture like it wasn't even there, while behind him stood two orderlies in white coats carrying the straitjacket and syringes filled with unknown substances. Rebecca, realizing the hotel is still operating as a psychiatric facility and she's about to become a patient, Rebecca screamed and threw her camera at the pale man, but it passed right through him like he was made of mist, and she realized with growing terror that whatever these things were, they weren't entirely human, and the orderlies moved toward her with mechanical precision like they had done this countless times before. She grabbed the heavy brass lamp from the nightstand and swung it at the nearest orderly, but the blow connected with solid flesh and he stumbled backward, cursing in a voice that sounded perfectly normal and human, which somehow made everything even more frightening. The pale man spoke in that same monotone voice, telling her that resistance would only make the transition more difficult and that she should accept her new role as a permanent guest of the Grand Monarch facility, where she would receive the best possible care for her obvious mental instability. Rebecca ran toward the window, planning to break the glass and call for help, but when she looked outside, she saw that the parking lot was now filled with people in hospital gowns, wandering aimlessly between the rusted cars, and their faces were blank and empty, like someone had erased their personalities. The orderlies grabbed her arms with hands that felt like ice, and she could smell that same formaldehyde scent mixed with something medicinal and nauseating, and one of them produced a syringe filled with clear liquid that glowed faintly in the dim room light. She bit down hard on the nearest orderly's hand, and when he screamed and let go, she tasted blood that was thick and metallic, but also had an underlying sweetness that made her gag. And she realized that whatever these people were, they weren't feeding on normal food. The pale man's expression never changed as he watched her struggle, but his eyes began to glow with a soft blue light, and Rebecca felt her thoughts becoming fuzzy and disconnected, like someone was tampering with her brain chemistry from the inside. She forced herself to focus on the camera equipment scattered across the floor and grabbed her backup camera, which had a powerful flash unit, and when she triggered it, the burst of light made all three figures shriek and cover their faces like vampires exposed to sunlight. Distraction gave her enough time to reach the door, but when she yanked it open, she found herself facing a long corridor filled with dozens of patients in hospital gowns, and they all turned to stare at her with those same blank, empty expressions. Behind her, the pale man was recovering from the flash and telling the orderlies to increase the dosage because this one was showing unusual resistance to their standard procedures, and Rebecca realized that they had been drugging the hotel's water supply to make guests more compliant. She ran down the corridor, pushing past the zombie-like patients, and some of them tried to grab her with hands that felt like they belonged to corpses, and she could see track marks on their arms where they had been injected with whatever chemicals were keeping them docile. The elevator was out of order, but she found a stairwell that led down to what should have been the lobby, but instead opened into a vast underground facility with medical equipment and operating tables, and the smell of antiseptic mixed with human suffering. She could hear screaming coming from behind heavy metal doors, and realized that the Grand Monarch Hotel was just a front for some kind of illegal medical experimentation facility, where people were being held against their will and subjected to procedures that were probably killing them. Her photographer's instincts kicked in, and she started taking pictures with her camera, hoping to document whatever was happening here, so that someone would eventually find evidence of these crimes, even if she didn't survive to tell the story herself. Through one of the small windows in the metal doors, she saw a woman strapped to an operating table, while doctors in surgical masks performed some kind of procedure on her brain, and the patient's eyes were wide open and aware, which meant she could feel everything they were doing. Rebecca's hands shook as she photographed the scene, but the flash reflected off the window, and one of the doctors looked up and saw her standing there, and his eyes widened with surprise before he started shouting orders to someone she couldn't see. Alarms began blaring throughout the facility, and red lights started flashing while automated voices announced that there had been a security breach in Sector 7, and that all patients should return to their assigned rooms immediately. The zombie-like patients in the corridor began moving faster and more purposefully, like the alarms had activated some kind of programming, and Rebecca realized that these people weren't just drugged, but had been surgically modified to respond to specific commands. She ran deeper into the facility, hoping to find an exit, but every corridor led to more medical labs and operating rooms, and she began to understand that this underground complex was massive and had probably been operating for decades. Then, she heard a familiar voice calling her name and turned to see her sister, Janet, walking toward her wearing a doctor's coat and smiling like nothing was wrong, and Rebecca felt her world collapse because Janet had been missing for 3 months after taking a photography job at a remote hotel. Janet explained in a calm, cheerful voice that Rebecca shouldn't be afraid because the procedures were actually quite beneficial, and that she would soon understand how much better life was when you didn't have to worry about making decisions or feeling emotional pain. Rebecca, discovering her missing sister, is now part of the facility's staff. Rebecca stared at her sister Janet in complete shock because the woman standing before her looked exactly like the sister she had been desperately searching for, but her eyes were completely empty, like someone had surgically removed her soul and replaced it with programmed responses. Janet tilted her head in that familiar way she had done since childhood, but now the gesture felt mechanical and rehearsed, and when she spoke, her voice had the same monotone quality as the pale man upstairs. And Rebecca realized that whatever they had done to her sister had erased the person she used to be. The facility around them was buzzing with activity as doctors and orderlies moved through the corridors with clipboards and medical equipment, and Rebecca noticed that some of them had the same blank expression as Janet, while others seemed more aware and afraid, like they were being forced to participate. Janet reached out to touch Rebecca's face with fingers that felt cold and lifeless and told her that the transition process was actually quite pleasant, and that most patients reported feeling much happier once they stopped fighting the inevitable and accepted their new reality. Rebecca jerked away from her sister's touch and demanded to know what they had done to her, but Janet just smiled that empty smile and explained that the old Janet had been full of anxiety and depression and negative emotions that were no longer necessary in her improved state. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor, and Rebecca saw the pale man descending a staircase along with several orderlies carrying restraints and sedatives, and she realized that her time was running out and that soon she would end up just like her sister. She grabbed Janet's arm and tried to shake some recognition into her, but her sister's expression never changed, even when Rebecca started crying and begging her to remember their childhood and their parents and all the memories they had shared together. Janet told her in that same calm voice that memories were just neurological patterns that could be adjusted or removed entirely, and that Rebecca would be much happier once the doctors helped her let go of all the pain and trauma she had been carrying around. The pale man reached them and congratulated Janet on successfully luring her sister to the facility, and Rebecca felt sick as she realized that her sister's disappearance had been planned and that she had been specifically targeted because of Janet's inside knowledge of her habits and fears. Janet handed the pale man a thick file containing detailed information about Rebecca's psychological profile, including her phobias and emotional triggers, and Rebecca understood that they had been studying her for months while preparing for this moment. Orderlies moved to surround her, but Rebecca still had her camera, and she started taking rapid-fire photos of everything she could see, hoping that the memory card would somehow survive, even if she didn't, and that someone would eventually find evidence of what was happening here. Flash from her camera seemed to cause some kind of reaction in the modified patients and staff because they all stopped moving and stood perfectly still, like robots that had been temporarily shut down, and Rebecca realized that the bright light was interfering with whatever technology they were using to control people. She used the distraction to run toward what looked like an emergency exit, But when she pushed through the door, she found herself in an even larger underground chamber filled with hundreds of hospital beds, and each one contained a person who looked like they were in some kind of medically induced coma. The scale of the operation was staggering, and Rebecca realized that this facility had been kidnapping and experimenting on people for years, and that the hotel was just one of many front operations they were using to lure victims. She moved between the beds, taking photographs and trying to identify the patients, and she recognized several faces from missing person reports she had seen on the news, including a famous journalist who had disappeared while investigating government corruption. Some of the patients had surgical scars on their heads and necks, and others were connected to machines that seemed to be monitoring their brain activity, and Rebecca understood that they were conducting some kind of massive experiment in mind control and psychological manipulation. A soft voice behind her said her name, and when she turned around, she saw an older woman in a patient gown who looked weak and malnourished, but whose eyes were still alert and aware, and the woman whispered that she needed to get out and warn the authorities. The woman introduced herself as Dr. Elizabeth Hayes and explained that she had been the facility's head psychiatrist until she discovered what they were really doing and tried to expose them, and now she was being used as a test subject for their most experimental procedures. Dr. Hayes told her that the facility was connected to a government program that was trying to develop methods of population control through psychological manipulation, and that they were planning to expand their operations to major cities across the country. She pressed a small key into Rebecca's hand and told her it would open a maintenance tunnel that led to the surface, but that she needed to move quickly because the effects of the camera flash wouldn't last much longer. Rebecca heard voices and footsteps approaching and realized that the staff was recovering from whatever had temporarily disabled them, and Dr. Hayes grabbed her arm and told her that she had to promise to tell the world what was happening here, even if it meant sacrificing her own safety. Pale man's voice echoed through the chamber, announcing that security protocols were now in effect, and that all exits were being sealed, and Rebecca knew that she had only minutes to escape before they trapped her in this underground nightmare forever. Rebecca, learning about the government mind control program and receiving a key to escape. Rebecca clutched the key Dr. Hayes had given her as alarms blared throughout the facility and emergency lights bathed everything in hellish red, while automated voices announced lockdown procedures, and she could hear heavy metal doors slamming shut one by one, trapping everyone inside. She ran toward the maintenance area that Dr. Hayes had described, but the corridor was filling with armed security guards who moved with military precision, and she realized that this operation was much more sophisticated than a simple illegal medical facility. The key opened a rusty door marked with radiation warnings, and Rebecca found herself crawling through a narrow tunnel that reeked of chemicals and decay, while behind her she could hear Janet's voice calling out coordinates to the search teams and describing her exact location. Tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, and her knees were bleeding from the rough concrete, but she forced herself to keep moving, even when she heard rats scurrying in the darkness and felt spider webs clinging to her face and hair. She emerged into another underground chamber, but this one was different from the medical facility because it was filled with computer servers and monitoring equipment, and dozens of screens showing surveillance footage from hotels and hospitals across the country. A man in a military uniform was speaking into a headset about expanding Phase 2 operations to include shopping malls and airports, and Rebecca realized with growing horror that the Grand Monarch Hotel was just one small part of a massive nationwide conspiracy. She started photographing everything she could see, including documents on desks that detailed something called Project Mindbridge, which appeared to be a government program designed to identify and neutralize potential dissidents through psychological manipulation and chemical control. The screens around her showed live footage of people in various locations being approached by pale clerks and friendly staff members who offered them drinks or meals, and Rebecca watched in real time as innocent victims were drugged and prepared for transport to facilities like this one. her camera captured images of organizational charts that showed connections between government agencies, pharmaceutical companies, and private military contractors, and she began to understand that this conspiracy reached the highest levels of power in the country. A new voice joined the military officer's conversation, and Rebecca felt her blood freeze when she recognized the voice of Senator Patricia Morrison, who was supposed to be leading a congressional investigation into missing persons cases, but was actually coordinating the cover-up. Senator Morrison was discussing budget allocations for expanding the program and mentioned that they had successfully processed over 3,000 subjects in the past year, and that public awareness remained minimal thanks to their media manipulation strategies. Rebecca heard footsteps approaching and quickly hid behind a bank of servers, while two scientists in lab coats discussed the latest batch of test subjects and how the new neural implants were showing promising results in long-term behavior modification. One scientist mentioned that subject 2847 had been Rebecca's sister Janet, and that her successful conversion had made her an ideal recruitment tool for bringing in additional family members, and Rebecca felt sick, knowing that Janet's capture had been specifically designed to lure her here. Scientists moved past her hiding spot while discussing plans to expand operations internationally, and Rebecca realized that if this program succeeded, it could potentially control the minds of millions of people around the world. She found a computer terminal that was still logged in and quickly uploaded her photographs to multiple cloud storage accounts and social media platforms, hoping that someone would see the evidence before the government could suppress it. But as she was typing a final message, the screen went black and she heard slow clapping behind her, and turned to see the pale man standing there with that same emotionless expression and several armed guards flanking him. He told her in his monotone voice that they had been monitoring her activities since she first checked into the hotel, and that her escape attempt had actually been part of their psychological evaluation process to determine her suitability for advanced programming. The guards moved toward her with restraints, but Rebecca still had one flash unit left on her camera, and when she triggered it, the guards stumbled backward, cursing and covering their eyes, and she used the distraction to grab a fire axe from an emergency case. She swung the axe at the computer servers, and sparks flew as she destroyed as much equipment as possible, while the pale man watched calmly and told her that backup systems would restore all data within minutes. But then alarms started blaring with a different tone, and emergency lights switched from red to blue, while automated voices announced that there had been a massive data breach and that external authorities were requesting access to the facility. Rebecca heard helicopters overhead and realized that someone had received her uploaded photographs, and that law enforcement agencies outside the conspiracy were finally responding to the evidence she had gathered. The pale man's expression changed for the first time, showing genuine concern as he spoke rapidly into a radio about implementing final protocols and eliminating all evidence, including witnesses and test subjects. Through the facility's PA system, she heard Janet's voice, but now it sounded different, more emotional, like some of her original personality was breaking through the programming, and she was warning other patients to hide from the guards. Rebecca realized that the shock of seeing her sister in danger might have triggered something in Janet's modified brain, and that there might still be hope of saving some of the people who had been programmed by this facility. Law enforcement responding to Rebecca's evidence, while Janet begins breaking free from mind control. The facility erupted into chaos as federal agents breached the main entrances, while emergency protocols activated, and Rebecca could hear explosions echoing through the corridors as the conspirators tried to destroy evidence before law enforcement could secure the underground complex. Janet's voice continued broadcasting over the PA system, but now she was speaking in her real voice, telling patients to resist the programming and remember who they used to be. And Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face as she recognized her sister fighting to break free from the mind control. Pale man was shouting orders into his radio about activating the self-destruct sequence, but one of his own guards turned on him and Rebecca realized that not everyone in the facility had been completely brainwashed, and that some staff members had been waiting for a chance to rebel. She ran toward the main medical chamber where she had last seen Dr. Hayes and found the older woman helping other patients disconnect from their monitoring equipment, while federal agents in tactical gear secured the area and arrested fleeing staff members. Dr. Hayes grabbed Rebecca's arm and told her that she needed to find Janet immediately because the neural implants could cause permanent brain damage if they weren't removed within the next few hours, and that her sister's life depended on getting proper medical treatment. Rebecca fought her way through crowds of confused patients and armed agents, while the facility's structure groaned and shook around them, and she could smell smoke, which meant that some of the conspirators had succeeded in setting fires to destroy evidence. She found Janet in the control room, standing over the unconscious form of the pale man, and when their eyes met, Rebecca saw her real sister looking back at her for the first time in months. Even though Janet's hands were shaking and blood was trickling from her nose, Janet collapsed into Rebecca's arms and whispered that she could feel the implant trying to reassert control over her thoughts, but that seeing Rebecca in danger had triggered memories strong enough to break through the programming. Temporarily, federal agents surrounded them, and a medical team rushed in to examine Janet, while Agent Sarah Chun explained to Rebecca that her uploaded photographs had triggered a massive FBI investigation that had been building evidence against Project Mindbridge for months. The conspiracy had involved dozens of high-ranking government officials, pharmaceutical executives, and military contractors who had been using facilities like the Grand Monarch Hotel to test mind control technologies on unwilling subjects for over a decade. Rebecca learned that her photographs had provided the final pieces of evidence needed to obtain warrants, and that simultaneous raids were taking place at 17 other facilities across the country, where hundreds of victims were being rescued. Senator Morrison was arrested while trying to flee the country, and several pharmaceutical companies saw their stock prices collapse as news of their involvement in illegal human experimentation became public knowledge. The pale man, whose real name was Dr. Marcus Webb, turned out to be a former CIA psychiatrist who had been conducting mind control experiments since the 1970s and who had perfected his techniques on thousands of unwilling subjects. Over the following months, Rebecca testified before congressional committees and helped prosecutors build cases against the conspirators, while Janet underwent experimental surgery to remove her neural implant and begin the long process of psychological recovery. Surgery was successful, but Janet struggled with memory gaps and occasional episodes where the programming would briefly reassert itself and she would speak in that monotone voice. Before snapping back to awareness, Rebecca quit her photography career and became a victim's advocate, helping other survivors of Project Mindbridge navigate the legal system and access mental health services, while fighting to ensure that similar atrocities could never happen again. Many of the rescued patients made full recoveries, but some had been so severely damaged by years of experimentation that they required permanent care, and the legal settlements from the pharmaceutical companies helped establish specialized treatment facilities. Dr. Hayes became the director of one such facility and worked tirelessly to develop new treatments for mind control victims, while serving as an expert witness in trials that sent dozens of conspirators to prison for life. Grand Monarch Hotel was demolished, and the site was turned into a memorial park honoring the victims of Project Mindbridge, while the underground facility was sealed and declared a federal crime scene. Rebecca and Janet slowly rebuilt their relationship as Janet's memories and personality returned, and they established a foundation that provided support services for families affected by government mind control programs. 5 years later, Rebecca published a book about her experience that became a bestseller and helped raise awareness about the ongoing dangers of unethical human experimentation and the importance of protecting individual freedom. Janet fully recovered her memories and became a successful advocate for victims writes while working with international organizations to prevent similar programs from being established. In other countries, the sisters bought a small house near the ocean, where they could heal from their trauma while continuing their work to ensure that the victims of Project Mindbridge would never be forgotten and that their suffering had meaning on. Quiet evenings, they would sit on their porch watching the sunset and talking about their plans to help other survivors, and Rebecca would remember the terrifying night when everything changed and feel grateful that they had both survived to tell their story. The end.